It was just a few weeks ago where I made a video and I talked about myself. And I'm not very comfortable talking about myself, but through that video I got a lot of positive feedback and a lot of questions. People really wanted to know about my watch collecting journey because I actually started that video talking about my watch collection journey, but I really didn't go through all of the details. Today, we're going to talk about me again. I'm not entirely comfortable about that, but we're going to talk about me. We're going to talk about my watch collecting journey, a little bit about my career as well, and the watches that came along the way. Now, we're not going to go through all of my watches. In fact, we're only going to go through some of the early watches, the ones that shaped my early collecting years. So, without further ado, let's talk about me. If you're familiar with this channel, if you know anything about me, maybe you've met me in person at an event, I collect what I like, and that is it. I'm going to be doing a series here where I go through my collection in the next few months through short videos that I'm going to be putting here on my channel. But my collection is odd. None of my watches are hype watches. But my watch collecting journey did start somewhere, and you're going to see a little bit of a theme in this video. A lot of my watch collecting has to do with my father. My father passed away just about 10 years ago, and he was a big influence on my life, and he was the person who really got me started in watch collecting. Even though I would say he was not a watch collector, I would say he's the one that is responsible for my current obsession with watches. My father was a bartender. He worked very hard, 6 days a week, and I remember him being at work all the time. He worked late nights because he was a bartender at a restaurant, and because of that, that's actually how I got my official first watch. The first watch that I received was a watch from a beer brand. And let me explain. My father was a bartender and he worked with beer companies. And one of the beer companies that he worked with gave him some swag. And one of those things was a watch. It was from Kirin Beer. If you're familiar with Kirin, they make Japanese beer, and they gave him a watch. It was an analog digital watch. It looked like an Arnie a little bit, but I believe it was made by Citizen. It had a Miyota movement. The reason why I know that is because I eventually took it apart when it broke or it stopped working. I needed to replace the battery, and I think I ended up breaking the watch somehow that way. But I put it back together, and I still own this watch. I still have this watch. I have the first watch that I ever got. And it's really sentimental to me because it is something that my father gifted to me. Now, back then, did that make me a watch collector? No, it just made me kind of interested in watches, especially the fact that it was analog and digital. It had an alarm, it had other functions like a chronograph. I thought it was really awesome. The next watch is yet another watch that came out of a bar in sort of a roundabout way. Back when my father was a bartender, people smoked in bars. And a lot of people smoked Marlboro cigarettes. And he used to take the UPC codes off of those cigarettes and collect them because back in the day, Marlboro actually had a catalog and those points could be redeemed for products. And my father actually would collect people's old cigarette boxes, take the UPC codes off of them, and then one day mailed them in and got a Swiss Army watch from Marlboro. It actually was signed Marlboro on the back of the watch. It had their logo, and it was a Swiss Army watch with a red bezel. I think this was like a resin bezel. It had a mineral crystal. Again, this is a watch that I don't have anymore. I think it got thrown out at some point in my life, but it was all scratched up. I wore it a lot. It was DLC coated or probably PVD coated at the time, and I just thought it was so cool. And I wore that watch a lot, and I do think this is probably one of the first watches that really sparked my interests. My next watch was my first automatic watch, and a lot of you might be familiar with this brand. It is a very obscure brand called Clinton. This was a watch that was bought at a yard sale or a flea market in upstate New York. My mother and father used to actually love to go to flea markets and drag me and my brother to these things when I was a kid, and now for some reason I like them as well. I think I'm going to find a Blancpain or something like that in a bin and pay $10 for it. I obviously know that's never going to happen, but it has happened in the past. But this was a watch called a Clinton. This was an automatic watch. Again, I believe this had a Miyota movement inside. My parents didn't have a lot of money, but they liked to do these things and take us with them, and we were always together. This watch meant a lot to me, and I actually still have this watch as well. It's a world timer, so you can see where I'm going here. I love world timers now. This is definitely one of the reasons why I love world timers so much. So by this time, I really had the watch bug, but I also started collecting comic books. And the next person to buy me a watch was my grandmother. It was for my birthday. She took me to the mall and she let me pick out my own watch. And I ended up picking out a Superman watch. So this was the first watch that I chose. I went and I actually bought this watch, and I really think of this as my first watch. It was a Superman watch. It tied two worlds together: comic books, which I was falling in love with, and watches. So technically I would say this was my first official watch because I picked it out. Obviously I had 3 watches before this, but this is again a watch that I kept in my collection. I still have this watch, and it is in very good condition because I cherished it and I took very good care of it. So at this point, I wouldn't have considered myself a collector, but I started to amass some watches, and I did have more than one watch, and I was probably around 12 years old, maybe a little bit older than that, and now I had about 4 watches. This is where I started getting into some more affordable watches. I ended up buying a Timex. It was pretty ugly Timex, but it had a kinetic movement inside that you got to see from the back, and that really sparked my interest because I finally was able to see what was powering the watch, and I thought it was awesome. And it had a rotor on there. I essentially thought it was an automatic movement. Obviously, it's not. It's a kinetic. It's technically a quartz, but at the same time, I thought it was really awesome. It had a power reserve. It had a very ugly case, a very ugly bracelet, but it was heavy and it was made out of steel, and it just felt so good in my hands. That was probably one of the first watches that I was really excited to own. It was very expensive at the time. I think I paid probably $300. I was working in a comic book store, and like I said, my passions were comic books and watches, and now I was getting more and more into watches. So this is where Timex came in as well. I started buying more Timex and more Seikos. The internet at this time really wasn't a thing. There was the internet, but it didn't really exist as it is today. There were very few places that you can go and buy watches. However, I was able to find one place. It was called newwatch.com. That would eventually become ashford.com. This was in the early stages when they first started selling watches, and they sold watches at heavy discounts. And I actually bought technically my first luxury watch from them while I was in high school. It was a Bois Mercier Formula S. This was an all PVD coated watch. The bracelet was PVD coated, and all of the indices on the bezel, on the dial, were in a mint green color. Now, when I look at this watch, looking back at it today, I realize it was kind of ugly, but I really did love that watch. And it, again, sparked some sort of interest in me for luxury watches. Now, it was a quartz chronograph, but it was just so cool. There was something about it that I loved. It made me really interested in luxury watches. My next watch would come to me when I was graduating high school, or I was about to go into college. I don't remember exactly when it happened, but it was a Movado Vizio. Now, I was never a fan of the museum collection, but when the Vizio came out, I thought it was awesome. I thought that the dial layout was really beautiful. I thought the case was really beautiful. It had these weird lugs. It was circular, but it had these angular lugs that really worked for me. I loved this watch, and I loved the bracelet that it came on. It came in a shiny box, which I actually still have. There was perlage on the outside of the box, and it was made out of metal. I thought it was awesome, and I thought it was really good looking. I ended up selling this watch. I think I sold it on eBay at some point years later, but at the point when I bought this watch, I thought I was buying one of the coolest watches that you can buy. So moving a little bit forward in time, I graduate college, and now I have a degree. However, I don't use the degree, and I decide to go into restaurants. My father was in the restaurant business, and he worked in the restaurant business his whole life. He worked as a bartender, like I was saying before, but I wanted to be a chef. And unfortunately, my father never wanted me to go into the restaurant business. He thought it was a really hard life, and he was right, but I still wanted to become a chef. I did not go to culinary school. I went to business school, but I moved to Florida on a whim with a couple of my friends, and I'm going to shout out those friends right now, Tim and Frank. I moved down to Florida with them, and we moved into an apartment down in Orlando, and I lived there for about 2 or 3 months before I actually got a job. Now, I had a college professor when I was going to college that really swore by Disney and their work ethic and the way that they actually treated customers and the way that they actually conducted business. He went through some classes through the Disney Institute, and he used a lot of that in his teachings, and it had an effect on me, so I wanted to work for Disney. I applied for one job when I went to Orlando, and that was to work as a chef in Disney. I went through a bunch of different tests at a bunch of different restaurants, which was a little bit unorthodox, but they ended up offering me a job, and I ended up working at one of the better restaurants at Disney World. It was actually, at that time, the best restaurant at Disney World, and I worked there for about 2 years. Through those years, I had no money because I was working as a chef, and even though I wasn't paying much in rent or using a lot of money to pay for food because I was working at a restaurant, I still had no money. I was getting paid around $8.75 an hour, $9 an hour. So obviously life was a little bit difficult. I was working holidays, Christmas, New Year's, it didn't matter. Thanksgiving, I was working all of those days. It was a hard life, 6 days a week, long hours, but I loved it. During my time at Disney, I did have one watch that I wore almost every single day. All my other watches I left at home with my family back in New York. It was an Edox that I wore, and it's actually kind of funny because an Edox was the first watch that I featured here on my channel. Edox are a really weird Swiss brand that are kind of, I don't know, I don't even want to say that they're an HSN brand, but they kind of are. Shop MBC or something like that. This was a Class 1, I think it was called, but I'll throw up a picture of this watch. It had a ceramic bezel, an ETA movement, a textured dial. I think it was actually a carbon fiber dial. It had a beautiful rubber strap on it. The clasp was really nice. This was a really good looking, well-made watch that I probably paid around $500 for. It was a lot of money to me at the time. It was the most expensive watch probably that I had ever bought besides that Bois Mercier, which I ended up selling for who knows what. But that was a beautiful watch, and that was the watch that I wore while I was a chef at Disney. So like I said, my father never really wanted me to go into the restaurant business, so I eventually moved back to New York because I knew my father wasn't very happy with me in the restaurant business. He wasn't really happy that I had left home. So I did come back to New York, and I started working in New York in restaurants. So I did come back to New York, but I still didn't fully listen to my father, and I went to work in restaurants. My first job was at Mesa Grill, a job that I ended up not taking. That was a Bobby Flay restaurant. If you ever meet me in person, ask me why, and I'll tell you why I didn't take that job. So eventually I did get a job. I got a job at Nobu 57, and I ended up opening Nobu 57 because they actually were not open. I ended up opening up the restaurant with the opening crew, and I was the omakase chef when we opened. I worked there for about 2 years. My boss was Robert De Niro, which was kind of cool. And of course, Nobu Masahisa, who is the owner as well with Robert De Niro. And I worked for him for about 2.5 years, 2 years, somewhere around there. It was almost 3 years maybe. And then I ended up leaving. And I actually ended up leaving restaurants completely. When I was working at Nobu, I was wearing a Seiko. And obviously not a correlation between a Japanese restaurant and a Japanese watch. It was just a Seiko that I ended up having on my wrist. That was a Sarb. It was actually a watch that I loved and I wore very, very often. It was great for the kitchen. It was extremely legible, and it had 100 meters of water resistance. Really good looking watch. And again, another watch that I kind of regretted selling. I remember it had a mineral crystal or a hardlex crystal in the back, and that upset me. I don't know why. When I put it down, it got scratches on the crystal on the case back, and that's the end. That's the end reason why I ended up selling that watch. Kind of silly. I wish I kept it. I thought it was a really good looking watch. So at this point in my life, I ended up moving into investment banking. Now, how does someone who is chopping onions and chives and cooking food move into something like investment banking? Well, I had friends in investment banking. My brother was an investment banker, and he helped me get a job, a very entry-level job in a very big major investment bank. And I have been there ever since. I've been working there for 20 years now. And that actually gave me money to be able to buy better watches. Not the reason why I took the job. I took the job because my father wanted me to live a more stable life. He wanted me to have days off like a normal person, not work on weekends, and have days off like holidays, Christmas, New Year's, and Thanksgiving, and all of those days. Unfortunately, 2 years after I took the job, my father passed away. So he was very happy that I actually changed my life. I wish, part of me does wish that I never left the restaurant business because I loved it so much and I was really good at it. And it took me a long time to get good at what I'm doing now. However, what I do now does allow me to do things like this, make videos, buy watches, and enjoy life. Go out to dinner whenever I want to, all of those good things, things that I couldn't do when I was a chef. I could actually afford life. So the next 20 years at this investment bank, it has brought me money, obviously, and I worked very hard for that. And I have bought a lot of watches with some of that money, not all of that money, obviously, but I have bought a lot of watches and I have amassed a pretty amazing collection. However, there is always ups and downs, and there have been times even when I've been at an investment bank where I wasn't doing as well as I should be doing, or I wasn't making as much money as I should have been making, or whatever the case may be. Life happens, 3 kids, marriage, all of those things have affected me in many different ways, and affordable watches have always been a staple in my collection, and specifically when micro brands became a thing, that was something that changed my collecting, and it kind of changed my life as well because it inspired me to make this channel around 6 years ago now. So that inspiration, those micro brands, inspired me to talk about how good they are on this channel, and that's the reason why I'm here right now talking to you. It was actually a Zelos, that was the first affordable micro brand that I bought, but it was also a Seiko, the SBDC 061. That watch was something that was very special to me when I bought it. I was blown away by the quality of the watch, so much so that I wanted to make a video about it. And then I ended up getting that Zelos. Also kind of blew me away a little bit, and there was later ones that really blew me away. I think the first one I didn't love all that much, but I really got into micro brands, and here we are. Now I am a full-fledged micro brand collector. I collect luxury watches, I collect micro brand watches, and I collect everything in between. But one thing that has stayed true throughout this whole entire journey, this whole entire story, is that I have always bought the watches that I like. Maybe later on I look back and say, wow, that was an ugly watch, but I still bought the ones that I found pleasing. When I looked at them, they made me happy. And that's the way I look at every single purchase. I never buy hype, but if I liked the hype watch, if I fell in love with it, I would buy that watch. Of course, I could afford it. So it doesn't matter if it's a hype watch or a non-hype watch, or if it's just an ugly watch. If I like it and I want it, it's going to be on my list of watches to get. And that's just the way I look at things. Guys, that's my story. I know there is a lot that I have said in this video. Tell me what you think down in the comments below. Tell me a little bit about your watch journey as well. It would be really cool if you tell me about your first watch down in the comment section. I want to hear from you guys. Please tell me about your first watch down in the comment section. You could just leave the watch name, or you could tell me the story about how you acquired it. I really want to hear it. And I think a lot of people out there would love to hear about people's first watches. I don't think everybody just gets a Rolex as their first watch. Of course, there are people out there like that. But like I said, that Kirin watch from a beer brand that was a analog digital watch, kind of a weird watch to get for your first watch, but technically, you know, I guess that was really my first watch. Anyway, guys, that's really it. Thank you for logging on. Thank you for watching this video. Happy Mother's Day to everyone out there, all the mothers who are watching this. Probably not that many mothers are watching because of my demographics. Not too many women watch, but happy Mother's Day if you are watching. And that's really it, guys. Thank you for logging on. Thank you for watching this video. I'll catch you guys in the next video.